Another world, another time, in the age of wonder. Another world, another time. His land was green and good.
Long time ago, when games were real games, when phones weren't mobile, when 8-bit consoles ruled the world, there was Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay really established the whole grimdark fantasy genre, at least so far as role-playing games went, if not books necessarily. And it was pretty damn popular over here in the UK. It was also massively restricted. Even back then, Games Workshop were incredibly jealous and possessive of everything that they did. And so the role-playing area for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was largely restricted to the old world, and that was about it. But we're not talking about Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay today. We're going to be talking about something else, but it's important to understand the kind of level of expectation that Wooferup created. You weren't playing magnificent heroes in this. You weren't playing the main protagonists that you might see in a fantasy novel, for all that you see a band of heroes ganging together on an ogre here. No, you were playing rat catchers and town criers and people like that. Ordinary people caught up in events that went way beyond their understanding. In a lot of ways, it was like Call of Cthulhu. You were facing down things that you didn't really have a chance against, and the powers of chaos were truly horrendous and beyond mortal ken. Ever since this came out, people wanted a Warhammer 40,000 role-playing game, and it never came. There were semi-role-playing games, skirmish games and things that came out, like Necromunda, but never a Warhammer 40,000 game. People kit-bashed them together themselves from the wargaming rules that used to cross over a bit better than they do now, but it never happened. But what we're going to talk about today is Dark Heresy. Dark Heresy was the first in the line of the first ever Warhammer 40,000 role-playing games. The license has since reverted and has been handed over to a new company with no real track record or anything. And it's clear that Games Workshop's idea of who and what they trust with their license has very much changed in the last 30 years. One need only go to Steam to see that they're licensing it to just about anybody. I'm half expecting to see an Adeptus Astartes version of Flappy Bird at any point. But that's not to say that any of the games, either the forthcoming ones or the ones that we've had, weren't very good. But Dark Heresy very much went against what was established or expected by Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Now, while you weren't playing Space Marines and so on until a later game, you were playing Agents of the Inquisition, you were playing heroes, you weren't playing ordinary people caught up in events. And this was in stark contrast to the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay approach. And in many ways it was quite surprising, because the heroic level of actions, even the Inquisitor and his retinue, which is what this game was based around, has all been done in the tabletop battle game, which is very much high level. People were expecting something more low level and unheroic from a Warhammer 40,000 role-playing game, and they didn't get it. And this was a cause of some consternation, and far from the only difference. Now, it was extremely well presented and well done, as you would probably expect from Fantasy Flight, who are known for the quality of their material, if nothing else. It's a little over-engineered in terms of layout and so on, but the art, the content, everything definitely brought across the feeling of the 41st millennium as it has been established in so many years of lore. Of course, this was prior to the recent changes in the newer editions of the tabletop battle game. And in this you would play acolytes. So already it was massively narrowed in terms of scope. It's a design choice that's interesting, but again confounded people's expectations from years of Warhammer Fantasy roleplay. And they kind of screwed the pooch on the fantasy license as well with the 3rd edition, but that's by the by. It also differed in that you were playing a class and level game, whereas in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay you had templates and you would not exactly level up, but you would pass through careers. In Dark Heresy you were very much locked into whatever you were. You chose several things to determine your background, but then you would essentially choose a class. Something far more associated with Dungeons and Dragons and older role-playing games, which had very much fallen out of favour. And these weren't things like rat catchers or that sort of thing. These were at least vaguely competent characters, and they were powerful, and they could cope, and they could survive. They weren't monster fodder in the way that Warhammer Fantasy roleplay ones were. And once you chose a career, you were very much locked into it, and that makes sense for certain things, like joining the priesthood, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and so on. But for other things, it always felt like you should be able to move between one thing and another. So going with a class and level system, when there was such a long history of moving outside and beyond that within Warhammer Fantasy roleplay and within role-playing games in general, it was definitely an odd choice. I objected to it at the beginning, and even got some replies from some people who worked within Fantasy Flight to my comments, trying to explain how and why they did it. And to a certain extent I can agree that the society of the Imperium is incredibly stratified. But it definitely seems to me that you should be able to at least muster in and out of the Imperial Guard or the Planetary Defense Forces. And to me it would have been far more interesting to play at a much lower level, hive dwellers, hive gangs, small trade ship crew, things like that, than at the high level of rooting out heresy and destroying people that you see in here. It also felt a lot less deadly than Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which is odd because this is a game in which you've got bolt pistols, bolt guns, chainswords, melter guns and so on. You'd think characters would be dying left and right, but that never really seems to happen when you get into the games. Also, a lot of the dark humour that, to me, defines British role-playing, British culture, British comics and so on, the things from which Warhammer took a lot of inspiration, these are largely missing from the approach in the tabletop role-playing game of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and this carries through to the other games. It's just largely missing. It's much more po-faced, much more serious. There's less of that cynicism. It seems to wear less of its influences from, say, Nemesis the Warlock in 2000 AD, for example, or Judge Dredd, which was the source of inspiration for the Arbiters and so on. Moving away from the obviousness of these influences is one thing, but losing the heart of them, the things that helped make the game such a success, the property, the intellectual property at least, such a success, that just seemed like a mistake. I mean, there's a few things where it's unavoidable. Orcs are funny, and it doesn't seem to matter what you do with them, they're always funny. I mean, they should also be monstrous and scary, but they're football hooligans in space, and that's really all they can ever be, and so that jars massively, I find, with the overall setting. It's also frustrating as a role-playing game to run, especially in this inquisitorial setting. This would open up more later with games like Rogue Trader, which were much more open, but given the absolute intractability of religion in the 40k universe and the reality of the chaos powers and so on, with morality being so absolutely black and white, though even if it's only between evil and worse evil, it's very hard to create adventures with moral dilemmas in them. Nobody is going to bat an eyelid about chainsawing a possessed baby in half in this setting. They're not going to worry about the child. They're going to worry about the heresy. They're going to worry about the corruption, and that's just what they're going to do to deal with it. So it's very hard to create kinds of adventures that introduce those kind of interesting moral dilemmas and choices, which is something I like to do in my games. I like to confront people with choices and betrayals and working with people they don't necessarily trust in order to achieve a greater good. But the idea of a greater good just isn't there in 40k unless you're playing a Tau game, and the option was never there. For me at least then, the game rather missed the mark. It wasn't what I wanted from a Warhammer 40,000 game. I wanted something much more in the tradition of Warhammer Fantasy roleplay. The class and level system put me off enormously. I'm not opposed to the old school way of doing things. I like old school games in their place, but this felt like it shouldn't be one. I felt like it should have worked a different way to the way that it did, and so that put me off as well. Friends of mine have had long successful campaigns of various kinds with the various games that they produced. That was another controversial issue. Rather than release a single game, they released several games, all pretty much using the same rules, but within different settings within the setting, if you will. So you had Dark Heresy for the Inquisitors, you had Rogue Trader for the pirates and ship captains and traders and so on. You had the Space Marine game. You had games set for the evil side. Rather than doing what from a consumer point of view feels like would have been a better thing, which would have been just to produce a singular central game and then supplementary material. But here's the thing about the economics of gaming: it's core books that sell. Supplementary material always sells a lot less. That's part of the reason why D&D has persisted in having separate player's guides, Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. And it's why back in 4th edition they were releasing multiple core books, Player's Guide 1, Player's Guide 2, and so on. It's the economics of it, and I think they overdid it though. Other ways of getting around this have been done in the past, like White Wolf with their meta plot, so that in order to keep on top of the story and all the events as things unfolded, you had to buy everything basically from every line if you really wanted to stay on top of everything. And that worked, but it exhausted people after a while. The same way core book churn did, I think, with 4th edition. And when it came to Warhammer 40,000 roleplay, certainly it seemed like a bit of a cynical move, and not one that was really very well consumer focused. And given the rules are the same and it's only a matter of scale that really, and power level that really differed from one to the other, it all seemed like a bit of a cheat. So I didn't really buy heavily in to the Warhammer 40,000 games. I bought this one because it was the first one out and I was curious, but it didn't scratch the itch that I wanted. I bought Rogue Trader because it seemed like it would free up the game a bit more and would have some expanded rules for ships and trade and so on that would actually be useful to me. But I've only run a handful of games based on this because it just doesn't work for me. I love the setting. I love the older versions of the setting. I picked up the first edition of Warhammer 40,000, the skirmish and battle game. And what was presented in that, and the rules that were presented in that, are far more interesting and better to me than anything that has come since. And the spirit of that game just doesn't seem to carry through into the tabletop RPGs in the same setting. I think they need more British people working on them, god damn it, to preserve that feel. I mean, it's not like the game hasn't progressed and changed over time, but that core of British sarcasm and cynicism and dark humour that Americans just don't quite seem to get on a cultural basis. It's missing. I mean, this is a bit of a piss take, but if you look at the way during the Trump campaign he was presented as God Emperor Trump and all that, as memes, as jokes, sure, but somewhat semi-seriously, whereas from a British perspective, that would be taking the piss out of Trump. It wouldn't be supporting him, even with tongue planted in cheek. But Americans just don't seem to get that. There's subtext there. There's cultural influences and references and humor and all the rest that's just not there. It's almost ineffable, but it's just not quite present in the games. It's just unrelenting horror without laughing in the face of death. And the game is diminished for it, and that's unfortunate. If I were to do it, if I were to design a new 40k game from the ground up, well, I'd go back to Woothrup, and I'd make it about the lower level, more forgotten people in this universe, with an opportunity to build up to something more. I'd make a full, open role-playing game without the restrictions of classes and levels and all the rest of it. And I would release the extra material, the things that you needed to play specific games, such as Space Marine games. I would release that separately as supplementary material. For me, at least, this incarnation of the game was a failure. It just didn't push the right buttons for me. But that's me. Plenty of other people, including my regular gaming group, have had plenty of fun with it. They're much more 40k lore wonks than I am, which may be part of it. Would my version, the things I would have liked it to have focused on, would that have been a success? It would have pleased the grognards, the older gamers. They would have been happy with it. Call of Cthulhu still sells, albeit at a much lower level than it used to. So there's that. You know, that kind of hopeless, against the odds, caught up in events beyond your control game can certainly have an appeal for people. So would it my version have sold? Yeah, probably. It's 40k. People would have bought anything with the 40k label on it at the time. Maybe that's starting to wane. Thanks, Steam. But we'll see, I guess. Well, it depends what the new game focuses on. Hopefully it's a bit closer to what I would have preferred. But I'm guessing it probably isn't, because people just love their Space Marines. And they love their overpowered stuff. So maybe the subtlety and so on isn't the way to go. Maybe I'm just a snob in the way that I would have approached it. Maybe my love for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay just gets in the way too much. But if you go back to that first edition of Warhammer 40,000, there's a whole bunch of what amounts to basically role-playing scenarios in the back, in a bunch of sort of random scenario tables, with farmers being attacked by high-tech bandits or aliens, and coming together and forming posses and so on to deal with it. And that, to me, would be a far more interesting way to play Warhammer 40,000 than to focus on the high level stuff that already happens on the battlefield. But you can feel free to disagree with me and call me a shithead in the comments. Maybe we'll look at Rogue Trader next time to compare and contrast, because that's much closer to what my vision of a Warhammer 40,000 RPG would be, except for the mechanics. Classes and levels are just shit.
Monster misbehaving, planets needing saving, situations graven, I'll form the head. The enemy is clever, we're smaller but whatever. When we put it together, I'll form the head. Y'all can do the treading, swing energy machete. If combination's ready, I'll form the head. I'll form the head.